As we turn our focus on the dynamic between the Roman and Gothic peoples, the subversive nature of post-World War II history becomes most evident. The picture of an all-powerful, civilized Rome, annoyed by Goths, in the manner that one might be bothered by a mosquito they might swat at any moment, is absurd. In fact, even Roman sources admit that were it not for the tactful diplomacy that kept Germanic peoples expending energy in their traditional war games with one another, Rome would have ceased to exist at any moment the united barbarian elements chose to make it so. And the truth is even more extreme. Even while warring among one another, the Goths were still able, on several occasions, to militarily dominate Rome, both on offense and defense. This isn't meant to diminish Roman achievements, skill, or discipline, a nation with justly admired armies, tactics, and leadership, but when viewed objectively, Rome, and especially late Rome, seems a bit more like a corporate construct running on pure ambition, seeking world domination by any means necessary, and gladly making use of any caliber of humanity in pursuit of this goal. Over time, they were to learn many lessons, incorporate this knowledge into their formations and equipment and tactics and strategy, and this counted for much. Coupled with a seemingly unlimited pool of manpower to draw from, one might wonder why they didn't conquer the entire world after all. The answer to this question is very simple and very clear: the Germanic peoples. The more one digs into the true relationship between these two major powers, although two is hardly technically correct here due to the permanently fractured nature of the Germanic peoples, the more it looks as if the Gothic mindset was something akin to, "That's a cute little human domestication experiment you have going on there. You're welcome to do as you wish. In fact, we'll even extend an olive branch to make common cause. Just don't cross us." But alas, the Romans did cross them, several times and in egregious ways. A perfect example of this treachery and its consequences, and one of the numerous stories of such important power that it's a wonder we haven't all heard it, involves the Gothic leader named Fritigern. Having brokered a deal with the Emperor of Rome in 376 AD to essentially ally the two peoples, and move a large contingent of Goths into Roman borders, a mutually beneficial agreement which would give the Germans additional living space and a closer relationship with Rome, and provide Rome with a ready-made source of the highest quality soldiers and military officers, and provide both parties with an alliance against the encroachment of peoples from the east, he began to move his Goths westward, anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000, depending on the source one chooses to trust. The impressive terms the emperor had offered soon proved to be largely empty promises, and serious famine began to spread, becoming so bad that many Germans began dealing with the most shamelessly greedy of Roman traders, with stories of desperate families going so far as to sell one child into Roman servitude to provide just enough food for the other, or simply in order to save their lives. Starvation was rampant. Noticing the increasing anger, the emperor decided to relocate them in an area in which they could more easily be monitored and controlled. There are two prominent accounts of what happened next, both speaking highly of Fritigern's heroism, and in fact both may be true. The first mentions how he'd long sought to quell the tempers of his own Goths and preserve the peace, yet simultaneously had made preparations for the worst, ensuring, quote, "the Goths would be ready to rise as one man should the occasion arise," end quote. And when invited to a feast by a Roman general, some of his near-starving Gothic troops became enraged at the sight of a fully stocked marketplace, in which they were prevented from buying goods, and got in a fight with and killed some Romans. The Roman general, roused from a drunken slumber, ordered the slaughter of all Fritigern's men. Fritigern, the historian Bradley states, quote, "in a calm and collective stroke of genius, announced it was needful for him to show himself to his countrymen to put a stop to the tumult," end quote, and simply walked out with his men, as the Romans looked on, stunned, unsure of how to respond. In the second account, Jordanus states, and I quote, "Now it came to pass, in that troublous time, that Lupicmus, the Roman general, invited Fritigern, a chieftain of the Goths, to a feast, and, as the event revealed, devised a plot against him. But Fritigern, thinking no evil, came to the feast with a few followers. While he was dining in the praetorium, he heard the dying cries of his ill-fated men. For, by order of the general, the soldiers were slaying his companions, who were shut up in another part of the house. The loud cries of the dying fell upon ears already suspicious, and Fritigern at once perceived the treacherous trick. He drew his sword, and with great courage dashed quickly from the banqueting hall, rescued his men from their threatening doom, and incited them to slay the Romans. Thus these valiant men gained the chance they had longed for, to be free to die in battle rather than perish of hunger, and immediately took arms to kill the generals Lupicinus and Maximus. Thus that day put an end to the famine of the Goths and the safety of the Romans, for the Goths no longer as strangers and pilgrims, but as citizens and lords, began to rule the inhabitants and to hold in their own right all of the northern colony as far as the Danube. When the Emperor Valens heard of this at Antioch, he made ready an army at once and set out for the country of Thrace. Here a grievous battle took place, and the Goths prevailed. The emperor himself was wounded and fled to a farm near Hadrianople. The Goths, not knowing that an emperor lay hidden in so poor a hut, set fire to it, as is customary in dealing with a cruel foe, and thus he was cremated in royal splendor. From this time, the Visigoths, in consequence of their glorious victory, possessed Thrace and Dacia Ripensis as if it were their native land." End quote. This type of famine, in this case caused by either Roman treachery or incompetence, was exceptional. And here we should quickly clear up another major misconception about the Germanic peoples. In most video documentaries on the ancient Germans, you'll see a disorderly gaggle of men who look like they've been cast to portray over-the-top caricatures of white trashy savages, often obese, disheveled, as if they've spent hours smearing their entire bodies in dirt, wearing equally dirty, tattered rags, waving weapons in the air like they've never held one in their lifetimes, with faces usually twisted in their best attempt at expressions of fierceness or rage, poor posture, looking generally unhealthy and mentally dull, and the impression we're given in videos and textbooks is that these men lived short, brutish, miserable lives. This is very much the opposite of what the fact picture seems to indicate. Keep in mind that, like the later Vikings, because these were unparalleled warriors that could demand tribute from virtually any empire at any time, and often did so, they were likely the wealthiest people in the world in a per capita context, with Rome itself paying them vast sums of treasure regularly. Not only has an astonishingly high level of Gothic medical technology recently been unearthed in places like Constantinople, but several accounts report men living to ripe old ages. Hermanric, described as the Gothic Alexander, who at one point, quote, ruled all the nations of Scythia and Germania as they were his own, lived to 110, and there are stories of leaders taking or holding their positions of power well into their 80s. But it's far more than lifespan. Consider how these men lived. It's recently been discovered that their teeth were far healthier than the picture that's always been painted, with the lack of processed foods and refined sugars not having a chance to take their toll. Their water wasn't laden with the chemical stew we face today. Their diet was as healthy and natural as it gets, and of course heavy on protein, and they spent their entire day, if not lounging or drinking by the fire, in the hunt, or in games of sport, or in warfare, or the training for warfare. Our modern epidemics of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc. didn't exist. Yes, many met their deaths on the battlefield in their prime, but I suspect the average man was far, far healthier than the average man today. They were also objectively larger and stronger than those around them, a trait that seems to have been passed down through the ages, as illustrated by a glance at the percentages of strongman competition winners hailing from Germanic nations, especially Scandinavia.
Now the champion, the man with a built-in megaphone, John Paul Sigmarsson. Of Iceland! Some very brave person in the crowd has actually called him an Eskimo. And he's heard that remark all right.
I'm not an Eskimo, I'm a Viking!
If he hadn't been engaged in something else, you might have put the record straight another way. But to the matter in hand, a small matter of 495 kilos. Or the definitive look of triumph.
And on this topic, there's another fascinating story about Maximin, a man of humble background who would eventually become emperor through accomplishment and merit alone. A Gothic Thracian, Jordanus tells us, quote, "After his years spent in rustic life, he had come from his flocks to military service in the reign of Emperor Severus, and at the time when the latter was celebrating his son's birthday. It happened that the emperor was giving military games. When Maximin saw this, although he was a semi-barbarian youth, he besought the emperor in his native tongue to give him permission to wrestle with the trained soldiers for the prizes offered. Severus, marveling much at his great size, for his stature, it is said, was more than 8 feet, bade him contend in wrestling with the camp followers, in order that no injury might befall his soldiers at the hands of this wild fellow. Thereupon Maximin threw 16 attendants with so great ease that he conquered them one by one without taking any rest by pausing between the bouts. So then, when he had won the prizes, he was ordered into the army and served his first campaign with the cavalry. On the 3rd day after this, when the emperor went out to the field, he saw him coursing about in barbarian fashion and bade a tribune restrain him and teach him Roman discipline. But when he understood that the emperor was speaking about him, he came forward and began to run ahead of him as he rode. Then the emperor spurred on his horse to a slow trot, and wheeled in many a circle hither and thither, with various turns, until he was weary. Then he said to him, "Are you willing to wrestle now after your running, my little Thracian?" "As much as you like, O emperor," he answered. So Severus leapt off his horse and ordered the freshest soldiers to wrestle with him. But he threw to the ground 7 very powerful youths, even as before, taking no breathing space between the bouts. So he alone was given prizes of silver and a golden necklace by Caesar. Then he was bidden to serve in the bodyguard of the emperor. After this he was pronounced to officer, often increasing his fame by his deeds, and rose to many military grades, and finally to the centurionship as a reward for his active service." End quote. So many in positions of leadership in Rome, especially military, were of Germanic extraction. So strong was this trend that the last several centuries of Rome's existence might be seen as a gradual transformation into a Germanic empire, as opposed to the sudden and stark shift many have been led to believe came to pass. The Goths, who in their disunity were pushed ever further westward by the Huns, began to blend into Rome in a sense. Their attitude seemed to be a mixture of respect and wariness, though at times bordering on disgust. They admired many of Rome's achievements, the architecture, the aqueducts, the orderliness and structure, but contrary to the impression modern history paints, they weren't eager to destroy, conquer, or become Rome in any sense. Gothic leaders were to make it clear, time and time again, what they sought was to coexist, ideally in a friendly manner. Yet the Germanic peoples were to essentially sack Rome 4 times in a mere 150 years. At virtually any point in this period, they might have made the choice to become Romans, with their heated floors, their multitude of bread and circuses, their marketplace, but they very consciously chose not to do so. And the long series of hostages taken from German noble families, raised nearly from birth in Rome, yet time and time again choosing to return to their homeland and their people and fight for their causes, speaks to this. On several occasions, Germanic leaders speak openly about the dangers of excessive comforts. When the last emperor to rule both East and Western Rome, Theodosius, died, whom Jordanus called a friend to and lover of the Gothic race, Jordanus speaks of his sons beginning to, quote, ruin both empires by their luxurious living, and to deprive the Goths of their customary tributes. The contempt of the Goths for the Romans soon increased, and, quote, for fear their valor would be destroyed by long peace, they appointed Alaric king over them, end quote. And this is telling. It's not ambitiousness or desire for plunder that seems to drive the Germanic assaults on Rome, but rather reactions to outright treachery, or obvious degeneracy or a lack of health and order in the empire at large. Much like Tacitus, I believe they saw a swift decline of this once great empire, and seemed earnestly to want to salvage aspects of its greatness. Alaric is an impressive figure in Germanic history. In his early battles with Stilicho, a half-German who for a time was the most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire, Alaric broke through Stilicho's lines, marched 30 miles north, and crossed a gulf before Stilicho could even put his troops in order, to surprise him completely. A masterstroke that the historian Bradley states, quote, "Travelers who are acquainted with the ground say that this march of Alaric's is one of the most amazing feats in the historical record." By the mid-4th century, the Goths within Rome already exercised vast control over the empire via powerful figures like the kingmaker Ricimer, a capable general loved and respected by the troops. Goths outside Rome, meanwhile, had established a very real power base in Toulouse. During the fighting between these two forces, Rome paid a large bribe to Alaric to compel him to retreat. Amusingly, the Romans then celebrated a triumph, treating this as a great victory, and inscribed on an arch that the Gothic nation has been subdued, never to rise again. Words the Goths no doubt read with bemusement as they rode through the streets of the conquered capital a few years later. A revolt of sorts set this ball rolling. In a brief fit of anti-Gothic sentiment, certain Roman citizens, likely spurred on by nefarious actors in their midst, made the grievous error of turning on the Gothic civilians while the Gothic soldiers were stationed elsewhere, and slaughtered their wives and children and looted their property. Approximately 30,000 Gothic soldiers at once deserted the Roman army and joined Alaric, who immediately rode from city to city, effortlessly conquering all in his path. Finally, arriving at Rome, he decided to engage in a siege to starve the town out. The extremely stubborn Romans began to starve to death in great numbers, and yet had the audacity to send a threatening message to Alaric, demanding good terms or else they'd rise up against him in large numbers. It's said that Alaric literally laughed at this, saying, quote, "The thicker the grass, the easier it is to mow," end quote, before presenting his terms, namely all of the gold and silver within the walls, and all of the slaves. "What should we have left then?" was said to be the stunned reply, to which Alaric simply stated, "Your lives." What makes this additionally amusing is that Alaric seems to have been merely humbling them. Not only did he end up taking far less after they finally capitulated, but it's reported he immediately saw to the end of the starvation. And although it proved impossible to completely restrain the Goths' long built-up anger, he further surprised the conquered population by punishing those that acted most unjustly towards the conquered Romans. Bradley states, quote, "Alaric remembered that he was a Christian and tried to use his victory mercifully. He told his soldiers that the plunder of the city was theirs, but that no man was to be killed that was not wearing arms. Even soldiers were to be spared if they took refuge in the holy places," end quote. He then departed to Tuscany, with his army even stronger now, due to a massive number of soldiers within Rome joining his ranks. Alaric could have conquered or destroyed the entire Western Roman Empire with ease at this stage, but he seems to have had no desire to. He wanted a kingdom of his own, alongside and allied to Rome. This was initially agreed to by all local officials, but amazingly, and again audaciously, a stubborn Roman emperor, Honorius, refused the idea, believing himself to be safe and out of harm's way, tucked away in Ravenna. Alaric was furious, and promptly marched his army straight away to Ravenna. And what follows is an almost comical series of losses for the Romans under Honorius, who seemed to grow more shamelessly arrogant and headstrong with each successive loss, until finally destroyed completely. No history of the Goths could be complete without a discussion of just how and why they became, out of necessity, so close with Rome, literally and figuratively, both as friend and foe, namely the Huns. It's important to remember that while we tend to see the Romans and Goths as two completely distinct races of peoples, both trace back to the same pivotal figures of legend. For example, their strong connection to the ancient ruling families of and refugees from Troy. The senators and aristocracy in Rome likely had significant overlap with the leading elements of the Gothic world, The intruder culture to their east, however, was something much more foreign. The Huns, likely born from a mixture of Scythian and Asiatic peoples, had exploded in number and had begun constantly harrying and harassing all Germanic peoples on their borders. Jordanus tells a tale, which may be fact or myth or somewhere in between, that speaks of a Scythian and Hun border near the Maeotic swamp, and a hunting party of the Huns chasing a mysterious doe, which they had reason to believe was something exceptional, who guided them into Scythian lands before disappearing. It's said that they were filled with admiration, which quickly gave way to ambition and greed, and after an initial raid in which they looted belongings, sacrificed many Scythians, and made the rest subject to themselves, they decided to make a habit of the behavior. Jordanus says, quote, "Like a whirlwind of nations, they swept across the great swamp, and at once swept upon the tribes on the borders of Scythia. The Alani, who were their equals in battle, but unlike them in civilization, manners, and appearance, they exhausted by their incessant attacks and subdued. For by the tear of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful, and they had, if I may call it so, a sort of shapeless lump, not a head, with pinholes rather than eyes. Their hardihood is evident in their wild appearance, and they are beings who are cruel to their children on the very day they are born, for they cut the cheeks of the males with a sword, so that before they receive the nourishment of milk, they must learn to endure wounds." End quote. Some of the Hunnish habits and tactics and customs were similar to those of the wildest border tribes of the Scythians, and in some sense might even be thought of as a racial or cultural midpoint between the Scythians and the later Mongols of Genghis Khan's era. Evidence seems to indicate that they were the descendants of the Zhongyu, a hybrid Eurasian people who show mixed European and Asiatic admixture at least as far back as 2,000 years ago. Germanic sources would often speak of the Huns in a manner that would be deemed extremely racist today. Yet they always respected courage and military prowess, and still more so, effective leadership. Attila appears on the scene like a rampaging lion, and lives his entire life in this manner, like a ball of immense, yet unchained and unchanneled, energy. The name actually has a German root, meaning little father, and Attila himself was almost certainly of mixed Scythian and Asiatic lineage. However, to the homogeneous Goths, the Huns and their leader would have been a shocking and exceptional sight. The historian J. Bagnall Beery says his features, according to a Gothic history, quote, "bore the stamp of his origin, and the portrait of Attila exhibited the genuine deformity of a modern Kalmuck: a large head, a swarthy complexion, small deep-seated eyes, a flat nose, few hairs in the place of a beard, broad shoulders, and a short, square body of nervous strength, though of disproportioned form." The haughty step and demeanor of the king of the Huns expressed the consciousness of his superior station above the rest of mankind, and he had the custom of fiercely rolling his eyes as if he wished to enjoy the terror which he inspired. The historian Priscus recounts his experience visiting Attila's court, recounting the semi-formal rituals engaged in during a banquet, and the multitude of foods offered, while Attila, seated in the middle of his 2 rows of guests, ate only meat. The anecdotes in his account provide an intriguing picture of Attila and the Huns and the culture and era. Quote, "When evening fell, torches were lit, and 2 barbarians coming forward in front of Attila sang songs they had composed, celebrating his victories and deeds of valor in war. And of the guests, as they looked at the singers, some were pleased with the verses, others, reminded of wars, were excited in their souls, while yet others, whose bodies were feeble with age and their spirits compelled to rest, shed tears. After the songs, a Scythian, whose mind was deranged, appeared, and by uttering outlandish and senseless words, forced the company to laugh. After him, Zircon, the Moorish dwarf, entered, and threw all except Attila into fits of unquenchable laughter, by his appearance, his dress, his voice, and his words, which were a confused jumble of Latin, Hunnic, and Gothic. Attila, however, remained immovable and of unchanging countenance. Nor by word or act did he betray anything approaching a smile or merriment, except at the entry of Ernest, his youngest son, whom he pulled by the cheek and gazed on with a calm look of satisfaction." End quote. He was, by all accounts, a capable leader, extremely courageous, relentlessly energetic, and, although wild and lawless by Gothic standards, not without some virtues and personal code of conduct. Most importantly, he represented the most significant and powerful threat that the Romans and Goths had ever faced, not counting one another. There's a deeply intriguing back and forth that gives us a behind-the-scenes conception of just how deeply this threat was felt, and also serves to illustrate the little-known closeness and camaraderie often felt between the Roman rulership and aristocracy and the Gothic element, likely due at least in part to similar genetic and cultural roots, a similarity probably sensed all the more strongly in the face of these new foreign invaders. Of Illyrian stock himself, Emperor Valentinian sent an embassy to the Visigoths and their king Theodorid with this message. Quote, "Bravest of nations, it is the part of prudence for us to unite against the Lord of the earth who wishes to enslave the whole world, who requires no just cause for battle, but supposes whatever he does is right. He measures his ambition by his might. License satisfies his pride. Despising law and right, he shows himself an enemy to nature herself. And thus he, who clearly is the common foe of each, deserves the hatred of all. Pray remember, what you surely can't forget, that the Huns do not overthrow nations by means of war, where there is an equal chance, but assail them by treachery, which is a greater cause for anxiety. To say nothing of ourselves, can you suffer such insolence to go unpunished? Since you are mighty in arms, give heed to your own danger and join hands with us in common. Bear aid also to the empire, of which you hold a part. If you would learn how such an alliance should be sought and welcomed by us, look into the plans of the foe." By these and like arguments, the ambassadors of Valentinian prevailed upon King Theodorid. He answered them, saying, "Romans, you have attained your desires. You have made Attila our foe also. We will pursue him wherever he summons us. And though he is puffed up by his victories over diverse races, yet the Goths know how to fight this haughty foe. I call no war dangerous, save one whose cause is weak. For he fears no ill on whom majesty has smiled." The nobles shouted assent to the reply, and the multitude gladly followed. The Romans knew full well how lucky they were to have not only an ally as a buffer between themselves and the Huns, but an ally who seemed to glory in such conflict, especially when united against an outside force. As the massive host of united Goths under Theodorid took to the field, it said Attila saw his army thrown into confusion and doubt. He sought to encourage them, to steel their nerves, and we have a record of his words that day. Quote, "Here you stand, after conquering mighty nations and subduing the world. I therefore think it foolish of me to goad you with words, as though you were men who had not been proved in action. Let a new leader or an untried army resort to that. It is not right for me to say anything common, nor ought you to listen. For what is war but your usual custom? Or what is sweeter for a brave man than to seek revenge with his own hand? It is the right of nature to girt the soul with vengeance. Let us then attack the foe eagerly, for they are ever the bolder who make the attack. Despise this union of discordant races. To defend oneself by alliance is proof of cowardice. See, even before our attack, they are smitten with terror. They seek the heights, they seek the hills, and repenting too late, clamor for protection against battle in open fields. You know how slight a matter the Roman attack is. While they are still gathering in order and forming in one line with locked shields, they are checked, I will not say by the first wound, but even by the dust of battle. Then on to the fray with stout hearts, as is your wont. Despise their battle line. Attack the Alani, smite the Visigoths. Seek swift victory on that spot where the battle rages. For when the sinews are cut, the limbs soon relax, nor can a body stand when you have taken away the bones. Let your courage rise and your own fury burst forth. Now show your cunning, Huns, now your deeds of arms. Let the wounded exact in return of death his foe. Let the unwounded revel in the slaughter of the enemy. No spear shall harm those who are sure to live, and those who are sure to die, fate overtakes even in peace. And finally, why should fortune have made the Huns victorious over so many nations, unless it were to prepare them for the joy of this conflict? Who was it revealed to our sires the path through the Maeotian swamp, for so many ages a closed secret? Who, moreover, made men yield to you, when you were as yet unarmed? Even a mass of federated nations could not endure the sight of the Huns. I am not deceived in the issue. Here is the field so many victories have promised us. I shall hurl the first spear at the foe. If any can stand at rest while Attila fights, he is a dead man. Inflamed by these words, they all dashed into battle. And although the situation was itself fearful, yet the presence of their king dispelled anxiety and hesitation. Hand to hand they clashed in battle, and the fight grew fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting. A fight whose like no ancient time has ever recorded. There such deeds were done that a brave man who missed this marvelous spectacle could not hope to see anything so wonderful all his life long. For if we may believe our elders, a brook flowing between the low banks through the plain was greatly increased by the blood from the wounds of the slain. It was not flooded by showers, as brooks usually rise, but was swollen by a strange stream and turned into this torrent by the increase of blood. In their wretched plight, those whose wounds drove them to slake their parching thirst drank water mingled with gore, the blood they'd poured from their own wounds. At dawn on the following day, when the Romans saw the fields were piled high with bodies, and that the Huns did not venture forth, they thought the victory was theirs. But they knew that Attila would not flee from the battle unless overwhelmed by a great disaster. Yet he did nothing cowardly, like one that is overcome, but with a clash of arms sounded the trumpets and threatened an attack. He was like a lion pierced by hunting spears, who paces to and fro before the mouth of his den and dares not spring, but ceases not to terrify the neighborhood by his roaring. Even so, this warlike king at bay terrified his conquerors. Therefore, the Goths and Romans assembled and considered what to do with the vanquished Attila. They determined to wear him out by a siege, because he had no supply of provisions and was hindered from approaching by a shower of arrows from the bowmen placed within the confines of the Roman camp. But it was said that the king remained supremely brave even in this extremity, and had heaped up a funeral pyre of horse saddles, so that if the enemy should attack him, he was determined to cast himself into the flames, that none might have the joy of wounding him, and that the lord of so many races might not fall into the hands of his foes." End quote. Jordanus follows this up with the story of the battlefield burial and mourning of the dead Gothic king Theodorid, in his unique writing style I find so appealing. Theodorid's son, Thorismud, now took control, and despite the total Gothic victory, was eager to avenge his father's death. Attila was probably surprised when no follow-up attack occurred, but this wasn't to manifest. Later, having gathered his wits and his forces once more, Attila, quote, sought to blot out the fame of his destroyer, and in this way, to annul what he had suffered at the hands of the Visigoths, he met a second defeat and retreated ingloriously, end quote. The united Goths couldn't be stopped, and the Huns would never again seriously threaten Europe. Attila was to die, true to form, after a night of drunken debauchery. Thorismud was betrayed under mysterious circumstances. He'd fallen ill and was being tended to, when someone gave word to his foes that he was both ill and disarmed. He was killed, but this fascinating line proves he didn't go down easily. Despite having one arm fastened to the chair for treatment, quote, grasping a footstool in the one hand he had free, he became the avenger of his own blood by slaying several of those that were lying in wait for him, end quote. This repulse of the Huns was one of the most important events in European history. Thomas Hodgkin, author of the excellent work Theodoric the Goth, the Barbarian Champion of Civilization, puts it perhaps too bluntly for the modern ear. Quote, for the world, yes, even for us in the 19th century, and for the great undiscovered continents beyond the sea, The repulse of the squalid and unprogressive Turanian from the seats of the old historic civilization was essential to the preservation of whatever makes human life worth living. Had Attila conquered on the Catalonian plains, an endless succession of Genghis Khans and Tamerlanes would probably have swept over the desolated plains of Europe. Paris and Florence would have been even as Khiva and Bokhara, and the island of Britain would not yet have attained to the degree of civilization reached by the peninsula of Korea." End quote. Although it's important to mention here, a hallmark feature of the Huns is that they weren't any one thing, but rather a hodgepodge of peoples, even picking up Gothic elements along the way, those earliest tribes they conquered prior to Gothic unity, and forcing them into military service. We also have this from Procopius's History of the Wars, written in the mid-6th century. "The Hephthalites, quote, are the stock of the Huns in fact as well as in name. However, they do not mingle with any of the Huns known to us. They are the only ones among the Huns who have white bodies." End quote. So this was not merely a hybrid people, but also a heterogeneous mixture of homogeneous peoples. After Attila's death, several of his sons, mere shadows of their father at best, jockeyed for power, pretending to continue their rule over the lands and peoples, including Goths, as if an inheritance of fiefdoms. The Goths weren't having this, and made quick work of the Huns. Now, ironically, in the same fractured and disunited position that the Goths had been in when the Huns first burst on the scene. As Jordanus so eloquently puts it, they drove them so ingloriously from their own land that those who remained have been in dread of the arms of the Goths from that time down to the present day. Now that the Huns were definitively dealt with, and the Goths had been gifted some newfound unity in the process of carrying out the task, slowly but surely they would go on to become the undisputed masters of all of Europe. And not just Europe, but significant regions of North Africa, and eventually Russia as well, as the Rus, from which it derives its name. This small family of peoples at one point subjugated and provided the ruling caste, if you will, for virtually all of the Western world. France as the Franks, Spain as the Visigoths, Italy and North Africa as the Lombards and Vandals, Britain as the Anglo-Saxons, and of course Germany and Austria, Scandinavia, Poland and Ukraine. It's a well-known but little talked about fact that all of European royalty spread from the seed line of these Germanic peoples. And yet, as was always the case with this group, there was no singular unified empire to speak of, but rather a variety of friendly yet independent branches. Rome itself had become a chaos with regards to its titular rulership. Due to the restriction that Roman emperors be citizens born within her borders, the Goths instead ruled as patricians, and the title of emperor became that of a figurehead. Hodgkins tells us of the 9 emperors who wore the purple in Italy after the death of Valentinian, only 2 ended their reigns in the course of nature, 4 were deposed, and 3 met their deaths by violence. Only 1 reigned for more than 5 years. Several could only measure the duration of their royalty by months. Even the short period from 455 to 476 AD, which these 9 reigns occupy, is not entirely filled by them, for there were frequent interregna, one lasting for a year and 8 months. And the men were as feeble as their kingly life was short and precarious, with the single exception of Majorian, 457 to 461, a brave and strong man, and one who, if fair play had been given him, would have assuredly done something to stay the ruin of the empire. All of these 9 men, with whose names there is no need to burden the reader's memory, are fitly named by a German historian the Shadow Emperors. 476 is traditionally known as the date Rome fell, although as I've just described, this is quite the misnomer. And from this point forward, the battles were largely between Goths inside the empire versus Goths outside the empire. It was in this year that Gothic mercenaries, which included the famed Heruli, formerly demanded 1/3 of the lands of Italy for themselves. After being refused by the Roman Orestes, a man named Odovacar said to the mercenaries, "Make me king, and I will obtain for you your desire." They did so, and with a Gothic portion of Roman military forces joining his side, The campaign was, to quote Hodgkins, of the shortest and most perfunctory kind, as Orestes and his bands of Romans were destroyed. It's said, aptly, that during this period, while men like Odovacar weren't formally kings of Italy, they were certainly kings in Italy. One extremely intriguing figure, who by all accounts was also a great, just, and magnanimous ruler, was to unite Gothic realms under a single Roman banner. Theodoric, born 455 AD, and attaining power first over the Ostrogoths in 471, then the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy in 493, and then the Visigoths in 511 as patrician of the Roman Empire. Of direct Amali lineage, by many accounts the most prestigious ancestral line of the Goths, he fittingly seems to represent the heart and soul of his people, perhaps more than any other historical figure. Like so many Germanic children of noble lineage, he was taken hostage. Again, this term is used in the most friendly sense, to Constantinople in the Eastern Roman Empire, to be educated by the best teachers and generals. By all accounts, he was much loved and respected by all, the Emperor Leo the first among them. As he reached adulthood, he, quote, heard that his tribe, dwelling as we have said in Illyricum, was not altogether satisfied or content. So he chose rather to seek a living by his own exertions, after the manner customary to his race, rather than enjoy the advantages of the Roman Empire and luxurious ease while his tribe lived apart. End quote. Essentially, he sought to rejoin his kinsmen and conquer Western Rome and its half-Goth and at least half-treacherous Odovacar, also called Odoacer. Quote, after pondering these matters, he said to the emperor, though I lack nothing in serving your empire, yet if your piety deem it worthy, be pleased to hear the desire of my heart. And when, as usual, he had been granted permission to speak freely, he said, the Western country, long ago governed by the rule of your ancestors and predecessors, and that city, which was the head and mistress of the world, wherefore is it now shaken by the tyranny of the Torsalingi and Rugi? Send me there with my race. Thus, if you but say the word, you may be freed from the burden of expense here. And if by the Lord's help I shall conquer, the fame of your piety shall be glorious there. For it is better that I, your servant and your son, should rule that kingdom, receiving it as a gift from you if I conquer, than that one whom you do not recognize should oppress your senate with his tyrannical yoke, and a part of the republic with slavery. For if I prevail, I shall retain it as your grant and gift. If I am conquered, your piety will lose nothing. Nay, as I have said, it will save the expense I now entail. Although the emperor was grieved that he should go, yet when he heard this he granted what Theodoric asked, for he was unwilling to cause him sorrow. He sent him forth, enriched by great gifts, and commended to his charge the Senate and the Roman people. Therefore Theodoric departed from the royal city and returned to his own people. In company with the whole tribe of the Goths, who gave him their unanimous consent, he set out for Hesperia. End quote. And immediately he set about restoring order across all Germanic lands and peoples, to masterful effect. He promoted and arranged marriages to those with the greatest amount of Amaline royal lineage, and united them under a single banner, as he made war with all in his path. In 488, in that oldest of the Indo-European traditions, he led a wagon train mass migration of his Gothic people towards a new future. Quote, it will have been noticed that the Gothic army is not an army, but a nation, and that the campaign is also a migration. The mother and sister of Theodoric are accompanying him. There is evidently a long train of non-combatants, old men, women, and children, following the army in those 2,000 Gothic wagons. The character attributed to them by Horace, as he states, the wagon holds the Scythians wandering home, still survives. The Goth, a terrible enemy to those outside the pale of his kinship, is a home lover at heart, and even in war will not separate himself from his wife and children. This makes his impact slow, his campaigns unscientific. It prepares for him frequent defeats, such as that of the Candavian Mountains, which a celibate army would have avoided, but it makes his conquests, when he does conquer, more enduring, while it explains those perpetual demands for land, for a settlement within the empire, almost on any terms, with which, as was before shown, the barbarian inroads so often close, end quote. And, quote, the difficulty for finding food for so great a multitude in the often desolated plains of Pannonia and Noricum must have been enormous, and was no doubt the reason for the slowness of Theodoric's progress. Very probably he divided his army into several portions, moving on parallel lines. Foragers would scour the country far and wide. Stores of provisions would be accumulated in the great Gothic wagons, which would be laboriously driven over the rough mountain passes. Then all the divisions of the army which had scattered in search of food would have to concentrate again when they came into the neighborhood of an enemy, whether Odovacar or one of the barbarian kings who sought to bar their progress. All these operations consumed much time, and hence it was that though the Goths started their pilgrimage in 488, probably in the autumn of that year, they did not descend into the plains of Italy, even at its extreme northeastern corner, till July 489, end quote. Amazingly, along their way, as they formally requested permission to pass through the territory of the Gepidi, their leader Trautilla sent back an insulting reply, demanding that they fight if they wished to pass. But the Ostrogoths could not now retreat. Famine and pestilence lay behind them on their road. They must go forward, and with a reluctant heart, Theodoric gave the signal for battle. It seemed at first as if the battle would be lost, and if the name and fame of the Ostrogothic people would be swallowed up in the morasses of the reedy Hyulca. Already the van of the army, floundering in the soft mud, and with only their wicker shields to oppose the deadly shower of Gepid arrows, were like to fall back in confusion. Then Theodoric, having called for a cup of wine and drunk to the fortunes of his people, in a few spirited words called his soldiers to follow his standard, the standard of a king who would carve the way to victory. Perchance he may have discerned some part of the plain where the road went over solid ground, and if that were beset by foes, at any rate the Gepid was less terrible than the morass. So it was that he charged triumphantly through the hostile ranks, and being followed by his eager warriors, achieved a signal victory. The Gepidi were soon wandering over the plain, a broken and dispirited force. Multitudes of them were slain before the descent of the night saved the remaining fugitives. And so large a number of the Gepid store wagons fell into the hands of the Ostrogoths that throughout the host one voice of rejoicing arose, that Traustilla had been willing to fight. So had a little Gothic blood bought food more than they could ever have afforded money to purchase. Thus, through foes and famine, hardships of the winter and hardships of the summer, the nation army held on its way, and at length, as has been already said, in the month of August 489, the last of the wagons descended from the highlands, which are an outpost of the Julian Alps, and the Ostrogoths were encamped on the plains of Italy. Odovacar, who apparently had allowed them to accomplish the passage of the Alps unmolested, stood ready to meet them on the banks of the Isonzo, end quote. And so Theodoric's army met the Western Roman army of Odovacar at Verona. It's said he displayed an easy confidence, and as female relatives helped fasten his well-built yet overly ornate armor, he quipped that while he'd hoped his conduct on the battlefield would prove to all who he was, but if that failed, the armor would certainly do the trick. The former would be the case, as both sides recount his heroism rallying his men to handily win the day after a serious struggle. Odovacar fled to Ravenna, and Theodoric pitched his camp nearby. As Odovacar fell, in Verona, groups of his men deserted to Theodoric. Among these was a certain individual named Tufa, whom Theodoric, short on generals, appointed to a leading role. He would pay dearly for this mistake, as Tufa subsequently gave up his entire army to Odovacar in the next engagement. Some of the men in his army were among the elite, the battle-tested chief members of Theodoric's inner circle, who had been with him through all the trials from the start. Hodgkins tells us, quote, "These men were all basely murdered by Odovacar, a deed which Theodoric inwardly determined should never be forgiven," end quote. A promise that would certainly hold true. Odovacar began sending raiding parties out to harass his men regularly, and although defeat looked inevitable, Odovacar chose to fight on for 3 long years. Finally, with many of his men fleeing to Theodoric and famine taking its toll, Odovacar could hold out no longer. Terms were agreed to, but Theodoric wasn't done yet. After 3 years of constant raids and unnecessary death, he had a score to settle. At a feast, at which some say Odovacar had plotted to have his men kill Theodoric, after making a toast, it said Theodoric then drew his sword and struck Odovacar in the collarbone, clefting him nearly in two. Astonished at the power of his own blow, it said he remarked, "The poor wretch must have had no bones." Hodgkins gives us an additional account, quote, "Theodoric raised his sword to strike. 'Where is God?' cried the defenseless but unterrified victim. 'Thus didst thou to my friends,' answered Theodoric, reminding him of the treacherous murder of his close friends given up by Tuva. Then, with a tremendous stroke of his broadsword, he clove his rival from the shoulder to the loin. The barbarian frenzy, which the Scandinavian minstrels called the fury of the berserk, was in his heart, and with a savage laugh at his own too impetuous blow, he shouted, as the corpse fell to the ground, 'I think the weakling never had a bone in his body.'" End quote. He then chose to bury him outside the city, in a piece of ground next to a Jewish synagogue, according to the historian Bradley, quote, "deemed to be polluted by infidel worship." End quote. Now that Odovacar had been dealt with, and Rome was essentially united with Theodoric at its helm as the most powerful figure of his day, his subjects must have wondered what the next chapter might bring, especially after witnessing his harsh initial actions in cleaning house of all those who had supported Odovacar. Any fears, whether Roman or Gothic, would soon be put to rest. Quote, "Once more we have to lament the truth of Milton's saying that victories of peace are less renowned than those of war. Far more interesting, if only it could be told, than the records of all the battles which Theodoric ever won, would be the story of the peaceful achievements which followed, by which means the Gothic usurper succeeded in giving order and prosperity to the land so long the prey of lawlessness and oppression. By what arts he so won the hearts of his subjects, both Romans and Goths, that when he died he was mourned as no ruler had been for centuries past, are questions which history gives us very imperfect answers." End quote. We do know he immediately re-established the grain dole to the citizenry, which the greed of previous rulers had stripped, immediately alleviating the threat of starvation for large swaths of the population. He wasn't the type of man eager to play despot or tyrant, in fact far from it, and he remains one of the clearest illustrations of just how much the Gothic people and culture were, contrary to their framing in our age, very much a net positive influence on Rome, and in fact seemed to salvage her in many senses from descending into chaos. Henry Bradley summarizes it thusly, quote, "Theodoric's great anxiety, however, was to restore to Italy its long-lost material prosperity and plenty. Of course, when the country was firmly and justly ruled, and the people had protection against violence and fraud, there was very soon a revival of agriculture and trade. Theodoric was eager to help on this revival by active means. He encouraged the opening of iron mines in Dalmatia and gold mines in the south of Italy. He assisted in the development of shipbuilding and fishing industries. He promoted the draining of the marshes at Terracina and Spoleto. He granted the reclaimed land, free from taxes, to those who had borne the cost of the undertaking. He spent large sums yearly in the repair of the highways, and in the restoration of the old aqueducts and the building of new ones. The extortions of the custom house officers, which in the days of the empire, as Cassiodorus says, foreign merchants had dreaded more than shipwreck, were now firmly put down, and the import duties were assessed by a committee, among whose members were the bishop and several influential citizens of the seaport town. A uniform standard of weights and measures was introduced, the coinage which had been debased was restored to its proper value, and the issuing of false money was severely punished." End quote. To root out the immense financial corruption he found himself facing, he engaged in the emergency measure of temporary price fixing, and, quote, "inflicted severe punishment on all tradesmen who ventured to charge higher rates. The exporting of corn from Italy was forbidden under heavy penalties, and if a corn merchant was found, quote, speculating for a rise, as it is called, that is to say, buying up a large quantity of grain when it was cheap in order to sell it at a great profit when it became dearer, the king compelled him to sell out his stock immediately at cost price." Theodoric strove to promote the welfare of his subjects, especially the poorer part of them, and on the whole, his philanthropic policy was wonderfully successful. In after times, people looked back to the reign of Theodoric as to a period of almost fabulous plenty and prosperity. Thomas Hodgkins states, quote, "The miserable historians of the time tell us far too little about the 30 years of peace which Italy enjoyed under the wise rule of Theodoric. Still, we are told enough to enable us in some degree to understand both what he accomplished and how he accomplished it. And one thing that makes us accept the statements of these historians with unquestioning belief is that they have no motive for the praises which they so freely bestow on the great Ostrogoth. They are not his countrymen, nor his fellow religionists. Our chief authorities are Roman and Orthodox, and bitterly condemn Theodoric for his persecution of the Catholics, into which, as we shall see, he was provoked in the last 2 years of his reign. Still, over the grave of this dead barbarian and heretic, when they have nothing to gain by speaking well of him, they cannot forbear to praise the noble impartiality and anxious care for the welfare of his people, which, for the space of one whole generation, gave happiness to Italy." Theodoric even crafted a succinct law code of his own. No offenses, we can well believe, were so hateful to the Gothic king's justice-loving soul as the taking of bribes by judges and the bringing of false accusations of crime. The first of these, under Roman law, had been punished by transportation to an island and confiscation of property. Theodoric, who significantly makes it the subject of the very first paragraph of his edict, decreed that the penalty should be death. End quote. Hodgkins goes on to list many of the heartfelt accounts of the chief authorities of the day, speaking glowingly about Theodoric's just rule in his excellent work, Theodoric the Goth, which I've again linked in the video description below, and highly recommend. The Gothic people had now gained a settled homeland, yet had to sacrifice some of their ancient freedoms in so doing, as Theodoric attempted to strike the best balance between Roman and Gothic laws and customs. The Gothic people never sought to blend in with the Romans, and in fact, laws were passed against intermarriage to the extent that some historians speak of an apartheid-like system, aimed at, quote, preserving their integrity and cultural authenticity. However, it was at this stage that the Germans lost their ancient custom of periodic assembly meetings, to make laws or decide on the policy of the state. Considering the military was now entirely Gothic, and they'd maintained the custom of carrying arms, they could have rebelled easily at any moment. But it seems both Goth and Roman respected Theodoric far too much for this to be a significant threat. It's said that the Roman clergy disliked the Goths, yet even they couldn't help but admit the Goths obeyed the precepts of their religion better than their own countrymen. And overall, relations between the two peoples went smoothly. Theodoric did not, as has sometimes been thought, endeavor to unite the Goths and Romans into one nation. Perhaps he may have hoped that such a union would at some time be realized under his successors, but in his own day he was content that the two peoples should live together in mutual friendship and respect, each of them being charged with its own special function in the Commonwealth. The Goths were to undertake the defense of the country from attack, the maintenance of order, and the execution of the law. The Romans were to labor for the development of art and science, while in the cultivation of the soil both nations were to take part. So long as Theodoric lived, this ideal seems to have been in a great degree realized. It is no wonder that Theodoric became the subject of many fabulous stories, and that tradition represented his reign as being almost a kingdom of heaven upon earth. Even before the 6th century closed, men told in Italy nearly the same story that was told in England respecting the days of Alfred, how the great king had so made righteousness to prevail in his realm that gold pieces could be left exposed on the highway for a year and a day without being stolen. Many of his sayings were quoted as proverbs in the land, and anecdotes were related to show how, like Solomon in the matter of the 2 mothers and their infants, Theodoric had displayed in the judgment seat his wonderful insight into human nature. But it was not in Italy or amongst the Goths that his legendary fame reached its highest point. The whole Teutonic race regarded his glory as their own, and his imagined deeds were the theme of popular songs in all the German lands. A lover of peace and justice, he never takes the sword save unwillingly, and at the call of duty. But when he is once prevailed upon to fight, there is none more fearless and more terrible than he. The reign of Theodoric is perhaps the finest example in all of history of what is called a beneficent despotism. No freer system of government could, under the circumstances, have produced such wonderful results. Perhaps with a freer system, Theodoric could not have established or maintained his kingdom at all. But the efficiency of the government depended wholly on the wisdom and energy of one man, and it might easily have been foreseen that grave troubles would arise when the scepter passed into weaker hands." End quote. As Bradley states, quote, "The more Italy prospered under Theodoric's wise and kindly rule, the more she became a tempting prize to the ambition of foreign kings." End quote. And it should be recognized that then, just as well as today, foreign powers often use money and the treachery it can so often purchase as their foremost tool. And this concept fittingly sets the stage for the third and final part of our 3 videos on the Goths and Germans, in which we'll discuss the Jews and the Saracens, court intrigue and mysterious deaths, Justinian and Theodora, and the treacherous end of Gothic supremacy. Until then.